The harvest has been counted, the rents have been collected, and the steward is finally ready to show his lord the numbers. Grain has arrived from the tenant farms. Fees have come in from the mill, the market, the river crossing, and the manor court. On paper, the estate has produced a respectable income. Then the expenses begin. Roof repairs, wages for guards, oats for horses, firewood for the great hall, food for servants, payments to skilled craftsmen, a new gate hinge, a cracked section of wall, money demanded by the king. By the time the steward reaches the bottom of the account, most of the apparent profit has disappeared. The lord owns a castle, several villages, forests, mills, and farmland, yet he may still need to borrow money before winter. That was the central contradiction of castle ownership. A castle looked like permanent wealth carved into stone, but it could consume money faster than the surrounding land could produce it. So did owning a medieval castle make a family rich? Or was it an expensive symbol that could quietly push even powerful nobles toward bankruptcy? The first mistake is treating the castle as the business. It was not. A castle rarely produced much income by itself. Empty towers did not pay rent. Battlements did not grow wheat. A moat did not create silver. The real business was the territory surrounding the fortress. The farms, villages, mills, forests, fisheries, markets, roads, bridges, and legal rights controlled by the owner. The castle was the headquarters of that system. It stored records, protected treasure, housed officials, hosted courts, intimidated rivals, and provided a secure place from which the lord could enforce his claims. Without productive land and people around it, a castle was not a profitable asset. It was a giant stone expense. This explains why two castles of similar size could have completely different economic value. One might stand beside a busy river, near a market town and a major road, collecting money from merchants, boats, tenants, millers, and travelers. Another might dominate a dramatic hill, but control little trade and poor farmland. The second castle could look more impressive while producing far less income. Medieval wealth came from control over useful activity. The walls only made that control harder to challenge. Before a family could benefit from any of this, however, someone had to pay for the fortress. Building even a modest stone castle demanded a level of capital that excluded almost everyone. A wooden fortified residence could be raised relatively quickly, especially if the owner already controlled forests and local labor. A serious stone complex was different. It required trained masons, quarrymen, carpenters, smiths, haulers, supervisors, and thousands of labor days. It also needed stone, timber, iron, lead, lime, tools, ropes, carts, scaffolding, food, animals, and access roads. The price was not simply the cost of purchasing materials. In many projects, moving those materials was more expensive than buying them. Records from the construction of Carnarvon Castle in the late 13th century show how extreme this problem could become. In one accounting period, the materials themselves cost a little over 150 pounds, while transportation cost more than 500 pounds. The stone, wood, and metal were valuable, but getting them to the site was the real financial burden. Heavy stone moved slowly over medieval roads. Ox carts broke wheels, sank into mud, and carried limited loads. Horses required food and handlers. Every extra mile increased the cost. Water transport was far more efficient, which is one reason so many major castles were placed near rivers, estuaries, or coastlines. Their locations were selected for military reasons, but construction logistics mattered too. A fortress beside navigable water could receive stone, grain, timber, weapons, and reinforcements by boat. A fortress deep inland might require hundreds of cart journeys for the same supplies. The dramatic location that made a castle look powerful could also make it ruinously expensive to build. Royal construction campaigns revealed the scale of the problem. Edward I's castles in Wales were not small private projects. They were state operations supported by taxation, customs revenue, borrowing, and the administrative machinery of a kingdom. Carnarvon alone absorbed tens of thousands of pounds over decades. Conwy, Harlech, and Beaumaris demanded additional fortunes. Beaumaris remained unfinished even after enormous sums had been spent because royal priorities changed and the money became harder to find. When the King of England struggled to finance several major fortresses at once, a private noble had little chance of copying that model without exhausting generations of estate income. Labor turned the building site into a temporary town. At peak moments, thousands of workers could be involved. Masons shaped stone, quarrymen cut it, smiths maintained tools, carpenters built scaffolding, roofs, doors, hoardings, and internal floors. Laborers carried earth, lime, timber, and rubble. Clerks recorded wages and deliveries. salaries, foremen organized shifts and punished theft. All of them needed to be paid or supported. More importantly, all of them needed to eat. A workforce numbering in the thousands could overwhelm the food supply of the surrounding countryside. Grain, salted fish, meat, ale, and other provisions sometimes had to be imported from distant regions. The owner was not just funding a building. He was feeding and administering a small settlement that existed only because the walls were going up. Even after the main structure was completed, the capital spending did not truly end. A castle was rarely finished in the modern sense. Towers were extended, outer walls were strengthened, gatehouses were rebuilt, residential chambers were improved, kitchens were moved, chapels were decorated, defensive designs changed as military technology developed. A fortress that looked advanced in one generation could appear vulnerable in the next. The building therefore demanded repeated investment long after the original founder was dead. This created an uncomfortable reality for heirs. They did not simply inherit an impressive property. They inherited unfinished work, deferred repairs, old debts, and the social expectation that they would maintain the family status. Once the castle was occupied, a different category of expense took over. The building needed people. A large noble household was not a single family surrounded by a few servants. It was an institution. The steward supervised finances, tenants, courts, and supplies. The constable managed the fortress and its security. The marshal oversaw horses, transport, and military arrangements. Chaplains conducted worship, wrote letters, and handled documents. Cooks, bakers, brewers, butlers, grooms, porters, laundresses, carpenters, smiths, pages, clerks, messengers, huntsmen, and stable hands kept the operation running. Some workers could be hired seasonally or dismissed when the lord traveled. Senior officials could not. Their knowledge made the estate function, and replacing them was risky. A skilled steward who understood local rents, debts, tenant obligations, court customs, and royal demands was worth far more than his annual wage. But that wage had to be paid whether the harvest was excellent or terrible. This is where the difference between revenue and cash flow became dangerous. A lord might be rich in land, livestock, grain, timber, and legal rights, while having very little cash available at the exact moment wages, taxes, or military expenses were due. Rent was not always paid in coins. Tenants might deliver grain, animals, labor, or produce. Those assets had value, but they could not instantly satisfy every creditor. Grain had to be stored or sold. Animals had to be fed. Timber had to be cut and transported. A noble could appear wealthy while borrowing simply to meet short-term obligations. The garrison added another fixed cost. Castles in movies are filled with ranks of armored soldiers. In reality, most peacetime garrisons were kept as small as the owner believed he could safely manage. Soldiers cost money every day, and they consumed food, ale, clothing, weapons, housing, and fuel. A major royal fortress might hold only a few dozen men during peaceful periods. That could be enough to guard gates, patrol walls, maintain weapons, and discourage minor attacks. It was not enough to withstand a serious campaign. Once war threatened, the owner had to expand the force quickly. Traditional feudal service provided some manpower, but it was limited in duration and increasingly replaced by paid contracts. A vassal who owed several weeks of service was useful for a short expedition. He was less useful in a siege that continued for months. Professional soldiers expected regular wages. In 14th century English service, a knight might receive around 2 shillings a day, while archers and ordinary foot soldiers earned less. Those amounts varied by campaign and status, but the broader problem remained constant. 10 knights kept under contract for a full year could cost hundreds of pounds before the owner purchased food, replacement weapons, armor repairs, servants, and horses. The horse could be one of the most expensive pieces of military equipment. A trained war horse represented years of breeding, feeding, and preparation. It could be injured, stolen, or killed in a single battle. Maintaining several mounted men required stables, fodder, grooms, saddles, harnesses, veterinary care, and spare animals. The knight's daily wage was only the visible part of the expense. The entire system that made him effective had to be funded as well. Then there was maintenance. Stone survives long enough to create the illusion that castles were almost permanent. The surviving ruins encourage that misunderstanding. The stone may remain, but medieval castles also contained vast amounts of wood, iron, plaster, cloth, glass, tile, and lead. Roof timbers rotted, floors warped, doors split, hinges rusted, windows broke, wells filled with mud, drains blocked, chimneys cracked, mortar washed from joints, wind damaged roofs, frost widened small cracks, damp entered living chambers and spoiled stored goods. A leaking roof was not a minor inconvenience. If ignored, water could reach the wooden frame, rot beams, damage wall surfaces, destroy bedding, and weaken an entire upper floor. The repair that might have required a few days of work could become a major reconstruction after several winters. Deferred maintenance saved money in the current year by creating a larger bill for the next generation. Skilled repairs were especially expensive because castle work demanded specialists. A farm laborer could carry rubble, but he could not safely rebuild a tower arch or replace lead roofing high above the courtyard. Master masons, carpenters, plumbers, and smiths had bargaining power because their skills were scarce. They also needed assistance, tools, scaffolding, transport, and materials. Every repair attracted additional costs around it. Keeping the building warm created another burden. Thick walls provided strength, not comfort. Stone rooms absorbed cold and moisture. Narrow windows limited sunlight. Large halls had high ceilings and constant drafts. Fireplaces burned inefficiently, sending much of their heat up the chimney while pulling cold air through doors and window openings. A great hall could consume huge quantities of wood during winter and still feel cold outside the immediate area around the fire. Fuel had to be cut, split, transported, dried, stored, and protected from rain. If the lord owned extensive woodland, he avoided buying every load, but the wood was not free. Forest workers still required wages or obligations. Carts and animals were needed. Cutting too much reduced future timber income and damaged hunting resources. A large castle with several heated chambers, kitchens, workshops, and guard rooms could burn hundreds of tons of fuel over a long, cold season. Winter, therefore, converted woodland into heat at an alarming rate. Food was even more relentless. The household ate every day. Grain became bread, porridge, and ale. Livestock supplied meat, fat, hides, and dairy products. Fish was important, especially on religious fast days. Salt preserved meat and fish, but had its own cost. Wine might need to be imported. Spices traveled through long commercial networks and served as visible signs of status. Rank shaped the menu. The lord's table could not look like the servant's table. Important guests expected generosity. Retainers judged a household by the quality of its hospitality. Food was not simply nutrition. It was political theater. A noble who failed to feed followers well could appear weak. A noble who entertained lavishly could strengthen alliances, attract service, and display confidence. But the performance was expensive. Great feasts consumed animals, grain, drink, fuel, labor, and storage on a scale that could absorb months of estate production. Famous late medieval banquets served thousands of guests and required hundreds of animals. Such events were exceptional, but the logic behind them was normal. Hospitality converted agricultural surplus into prestige. The return was political rather than financial, which made it difficult to measure. A feast might help secure a marriage, confirm an alliance, impress royal officials, or reward retainers. It might also produce nothing more than a memorable evening and an empty storehouse. The most dangerous guest was the ruler. Kings and their courts traveled, and hosting them could place extraordinary pressure on a private household. The host had to provide rooms, food, drink, stabling, servants, gifts, temporary kitchens, repairs, security, and entertainment. A royal visit was an honor because it displayed access to power. It was also a forced demonstration of wealth. Refusing to spend enough risked humiliation. Spending enough could require borrowing. Although some of the best documented examples come from the Tudor period, the underlying obligation was older. Medieval lords also paid upward through military service, extraordinary taxes, gifts, loans, and hospitality. The king could demand resources at the exact moment the estate was least able to provide them. Agricultural income followed the seasons. Royal need did not. So where did the money come from? The foundation was land rent. Tenant farmers occupied holdings and paid the lord in cash, crops, animals, or labor. The exact arrangements varied by region and century, but the principle was stable. The owner received part of the value produced by the people working his land. A large estate spread this risk across many villages. One field might fail while another produced well. One tenant might default while others paid. Scale gave powerful families an advantage. A minor knight dependent on a single manor could be devastated by local flooding. A great magnate with estates in several counties could survive one region's bad harvest. The castle also benefited from monopolies. The lord often controlled essential facilities, such as the grain mill, communal oven, wine press, market, or river crossing. Tenants might be required to use the lord's mill and surrender a portion of the grain as payment. Each individual fee was small, but the service was repeated constantly. Every household needed flour. Every harvest created customers. A mill, therefore, produced regular income with less uncertainty than a single annual rent. It also required maintenance, water rights, millstones, timber, and a competent miller. The monopoly made it valuable, not effortless. Markets and fairs created another stream. A lord with the legal right to hold a market could charge stall fees, collect tolls, regulate weights, and benefit from the trade drawn into the settlement. Merchants brought cloth, salt, metal goods, wine, livestock, and tools. Local producers gained buyers. The lord gained revenue from the activity. The most profitable asset might not be inside the castle at all. It might be a market charter, a bridge, a mill, or a section of road that merchants had little choice but to use. Courts generated money too. The manor court settled disputes, recorded land transfers, enforced obligations, punished minor offenses, and confirmed inheritance. Fees accompanied many of these acts. Tenants could pay to bring a case, enter a property, inherit a holding, receive permission for a marriage, or settle a violation. A stray animal, an illegal use of woodland, an unpaid obligation, or a broken local rule could result in a fine. To modernize, the castle might seem to be earning money from law enforcement. In practice, financial extraction and administration were deeply connected. The lord's legal authority protected his revenue, and his revenue paid for the authority that enforced it. Location could transform the entire balance sheet. A castle near a major trade route gained access to money that did not depend directly on the local harvest. Boats, wagons, livestock, pack animals, and travelers could all be charged according to local rights. Along sections of the Rhine, fortified toll stations extracted payment from river traffic. Some positions could physically stop boats until the fee was paid. A bridge or narrow crossing created the same advantage on land. The owner controlled a bottleneck. Merchants complained about such charges, but avoiding them might require a long, dangerous detour. This was one of the castle economy's hidden strengths. The most successful fortress did not necessarily produce wealth. It positioned the owner to intercept wealth already moving through the region. That income could be substantial, but it depended on peace and traffic. War could redirect merchants. A new bridge could reduce the value of an old crossing. A king could cancel toll rights. Rivals could challenge the owner. Banditry could make the road unsafe. Trade revenue was less dependent on rainfall than farm rent, but it was highly dependent on politics and security. And war was the event that could destroy every careful calculation. In peacetime, the owner tried to minimize military spending. During a crisis, he had to buy everything at once. Grain, salted meat, arrows, crossbow bolts, timber, stone, water containers, medical supplies, replacement tools, and additional fuel had to be gathered before a siege. Prices rose because every nearby fortress was purchasing the same goods. Mercenaries demanded higher wages because their services were urgently needed. Carters charged more because the roads were dangerous. Suppliers insisted on cash. A castle designed to protect wealth could suddenly require the owner to liquidate that wealth just to remain defensible. Even a successful defense could be financially disastrous. Siege engines damaged walls and towers. Fire destroyed roofs and internal buildings. Defenders consumed months of stored food without producing income. Fields went unplanted, villages were abandoned, livestock was stolen or slaughtered, mills stopped operating, merchants chose safer routes. In preparation for attack, defenders sometimes demolished nearby buildings and cut down orchards so the enemy would have less cover. They were destroying their own economic base to protect the fortress at its center. The castle might survive while the system that paid for it disappeared. Rebuilding villages, farms, mills, and trade relationships could take years. Debt filled the gap. Noble families borrowed against future rents, expected harvests, customs income, or royal favor. Credit allowed them to survive a bad year, finance a campaign, arrange a marriage, or repair a fortress. It also transferred risk into the future. If the next harvest was good, the loan might be repaid. If war continued or crops failed again, interest accumulated. New borrowing covered old obligations. The estate remained impressive from the outside, while its future income had already been promised to creditors. The 14th century demonstrated how dangerous this system could become. Famine, disease, war, and unstable prices struck in repeated waves. Even kings borrowed on a scale that could threaten major banking houses. A smaller noble family faced the same mechanism with less room for error. One failed harvest could be managed. Two or three, combined with military obligations and repairs, could force the sale or mortgage of land. Once productive land was sold, future income fell, making the remaining castle even harder to support. The family protected the symbol of power by selling the assets that made the symbol affordable. Consider a good year. The weather is favorable, grain prices are stable, tenants deliver rent, the mill operates continuously after harvest. The market attracts merchants, river traffic remains strong. No major repairs are needed. The king demands no extraordinary payment. The garrison stays small. The lord may finish the year with a meaningful surplus. That money can strengthen walls, purchase land, arrange marriages, repay debt, or build reserves for the future. The castle appears to be working exactly as intended. Now consider a bad year. Rain ruins part of the harvest. Several tenants cannot pay. The mill processes less grain. A roof begins leaking. A tower needs urgent masonry. The king calls for soldiers. Additional horses must be purchased. Merchants avoid the road because of fighting. Food prices rise. The household cannot easily shrink because officials, guards, and servants are still needed. Revenue falls while expenses rise. The same castle that produced influence during the good year becomes a machine for converting debt into survival. This is why castle ownership favored families that were already wealthy. A rich dynasty could spread risk across many estates, borrow at better terms, call on political allies, and survive several poor seasons. A minor lord might own a fortress, but lack the reserves to operate it properly. He could not dismiss the entire garrison without becoming vulnerable. He could not stop maintaining the roof without damaging the building. He could not refuse royal obligations without risking punishment. His status trapped him inside a level of spending he could no longer afford. Ownership was therefore not enough. Successful castle management required diversified income, disciplined administration, political protection, and the ability to preserve cash during good years. The smartest owners did not treat every surplus as an excuse for a larger feast or a taller tower. They invested in mills, markets, bridges, farmland, storage, and roads. They kept records. They limited the peacetime garrison. They repaired small problems before they became structural failures. They protected tenant production because abused or impoverished tenants could not generate rent. They placed officials who understood both law and accounting in charge of the estate. Most importantly, they recognized what the castle actually purchased. It did not purchase guaranteed profit. It purchased control. It gave the family a defensible headquarters, a court, a prison, a storehouse, a military base, a residence, and a stage on which power could be performed. That control made rents collectible, tolls enforceable, markets secure, and rivals cautious. Measured only as a building, the castle was usually a poor investment. Its construction costs were immense, its operating expenses relentless, and its resale value irrelevant in a world where land and political rights mattered more than stone. Measured as the central instrument of a territorial power system, however, it could be indispensable. The castle did not make money in the way a mill, workshop, or merchant ship did. It protected and enforced the network that made money around it. That is the final answer. Owning a medieval castle could help preserve a fortune, expand a dynasty, and dominate a region, but only when the owner already controlled productive land, reliable rights, political relationships, and enough reserves to survive bad years. For everyone else, the walls were not proof of wealth. They were a permanent bill, built in stone, waiting for the next harvest, the next war, or the next creditor to arrive at the gate.